Hi. So tomorrow, the 24th of February, marks 2 years to the day since Russia invaded Ukraine, and it's been one of the defining events of the 2020s. Um, I want to talk about a narrative that's out there, and it's both in the Russosphere and the Russian internet, but also I feel is permeated around the world, which is Russia the victim. This narrative that Russia is actually the victim. I mean, that's kind of perverse. It's kind of like saying a burglar breaks into someone's house and they're really the victim, for want of a better analogy. But I want to directly address some of the claims that I've seen, which, in my opinion, just don't add up to reality. The basic premise of this argument, and I have to say, it comes from both Putin supporters and people who don't support Putin. It would be wrong to say they're all Putin supporters who don't support Putin, and they would even criticize the invasion of Ukraine, but they think the situation is more nuanced or more 50-50, um, or even that it's a question of, well, we're mostly with Ukraine, but Russia's also been a victim of um, X, Y, and Z. I have a big problem with that, and fundamentally, I think the mistake that they make, in my opinion, is they are treating the Russian government like it's just any other government. Like it's just that the Putin regime is just acting like any other government, that it's sort of self-interested and it's doing what's best for the Russian people. Well, I don't think Putin's doing what's best for the Russian people. That's the first thing. Um, but I think it's very important to understand the nature of this regime. I'm reading a very good book at the moment. I'll show you. Mafia State by the Guardian journalist Luke Harding. This guy lived in Russia. He speaks fluent Russian, or certainly workable Russian. He lived there. He's traveled extensively around Russia. He's done many interviews. Despite what Tucker Carlson claims, Harding hasn't interviewed Putin, but he's interviewed pro-Putinists. There's let's say a lot of color pictures here. He had his flat in Moscow repeatedly bugged and unsettled by the FSB. By unsettled, I mean they would do psychological techniques like move things around and stuff. He wasn't physically attacked, but it was all psychological. Um, this is Luke Harding, and that's a video cassette on the death of Alexander Litvinenko, and he says that a video of a BBC Panorama program on Litvinenko recorded by a friend. The FSB erased the tape during a break-in. The voiceover was just audible but sounded like Mickey Mouse. The picture disappeared. This is the sort of psychological things the FSB does. And this book was published, I think, in 2011, so long before the invasion of Ukraine. He also cites um, individuals like, well, there are three: Alexander Litvinenko, um, Anna Politkovskaya. I've also got a book by this lady. In fact, I have a book by Litvinenko and Politkovskaya, blowing up Russia and Putin's Russia, respectively, and Natalia Estemirova, who's a human rights activist who works for Memorial. All three are dead. That's the nature of the Putin regime, and why I have little patience with this idea that it should just be treated like a normal government. Now, Russia's a powerful country. I think it has been weakened since this war began, but it is a powerful country. There's no point pretending otherwise. It's a vast country. It's the world's biggest country by area. It's a large military, but how efficient they are is definitely a matter of debate. Putin was boasting about the Battle of, if I'm pronouncing that town correctly, Avdiivka, I think it's called. But that was actually a tactical retreat by the Ukrainians. And Putin failed to mention that there was a Ukrainian strike on his forces that killed 65 Russian personnel a few days ago. Um, I mean, that's how much care Putin has for his own men. Anyway, this is really, really insightful book into the nature of the Putin regime. So anyway, to get into this argument, I'm going to address some of the claims that are made. One that is most sort of persistent is Russia has acted the way it has because it feels threatened by NATO, and NATO has expanded. And so Russia is simply defending itself from NATO expansion. It's true that NATO has expanded. It's true that it's got bigger, and it's true that this goes against promises that it wouldn't. But things change due to political circumstances, and as Russia has got more aggressive over the years, it's been clear that countries have felt compelled to join NATO as a matter of security. Because as brutal as Russia under Putin is, it's not stupid. I don't think it would attack a NATO country without significant concern. The reason it attacked Ukraine, well, there was many reasons, irredentist obsessions, but Ukraine wasn't a member of NATO. Hence, they knew that. I think actually what the Putin regime gathered was, well, there'll be protests, there'll be anger, but we'll get away with this. Well, they haven't got away with it. They thought the war would be over briefly, and it's now 2 years. The incredible courage and resilience of the Ukrainian people, but also Western support. I think Putin was surprised at the level of Western support there has been. Um, but Ukraine is not the only country to have been targeted by Russia. Georgia, the 2008 Georgian war, timed, I suspect, to coincide with the opening of the Beijing Olympics when the world was looking at that. Um, And we could talk about the two brutal wars in Chechnya, which technically is within Russian territory, but certainly there were some brutal things committed by both sides, it has to be said. But the conclusion to that was Putin installing a lackey, a thug even worse than himself, arguably, Ramzan Kadyrov, as the puppet leader there. I mean, Kadyrov runs a regime that's possibly even more brutal than Putin's itself, albeit on a smaller scale. Another Putin lackey, President Alexander Lukashenko in Belarus. I mean, you see this trajectory where there's these puppets of Putin who are just as ruthless, and they play his game of ruthlessly crushing dissent, but he's trying to get them into the Russosphere. Um, well, they're already there. It's not a question of getting them into it, but the thing about we need to look at history. When the Cold War ended, it is true that it was a difficult time for Russia. There was drastic changes going on. Um, on one hand, there was more political freedom, but it's true that there was a rise in crony capitalism and violent crime. Yeltsin's Russia was a dangerous place. There was violent crime, worse than it was in the Soviet era. So when people would say I'm very biased for the West, I do understand why Putin got into power. I get it. There was a sense of national humiliation. People were fed up with Yeltsin, and they were disillusioned and angry. And frankly, if I was a Russian citizen in the early 2000s, I would have considered voting for Putin at that time. So I'm not naive as to how Putin got into power. But the thing is, he's just stayed in power and stayed in power and stayed in power. And he's just a tired old tyrant, in the same mold as those old Soviet leaders like his former boss, Yuri Andropov. There are now more political prisoners in Russia than there was even at the height of Brezhnev's regime, and that is saying something. Some of the prominent opponents of Putin that have found themselves either in prison or targeted, Vladimir Kara-Murza, who is also a British citizen, and the journalist Evan Gershkovich, Yulia Navalnaya, she's going to certainly be a target. Bill Browder, um, who has spoken out for his friend Alexei Navalny, he now has to live in a secret location. And they're just some prominent examples. There's many, many others. It would not at all surprise me if some of those people we find up end up dead. That is the nature of the Putin regime. But anyway, there was a period of optimism, perhaps around the early 2000s, notwithstanding criticism of human rights in Chechnya. There was relatively good relations between Russia and the West for a while in the early 2000s. And I mean, relatively speaking, it's never been good with Putin. But the fact of the matter is, if you listen to those who say that the West is just taking advantage of Russia, it would kind of set this narrative that the West has just gloated at Russia's expense because Russia lost the Cold War. Well, the Soviet Union did, but Russia being the largest state within that empire. Um, but what happened with one of the first big disasters on Putin's watch, the Kursk submarine tragedy? Britain and Norway offered to assist. Putin rejected it. And in the end, dozens of sailors lost their lives. It's not a guarantee they would have survived with British and Norwegian help, but that counters the claim that the West had an agenda against Putin's Russia. Russia was a member of the G8. I remember going to the Live 8 concert in London. It was a major pop concert, basically, as part of the Make Poverty History campaign in London. And Russia at that time was in the G8, and there was posters showing the G8 leaders at that time: George W. Bush, Tony Blair, Canada's Paul Martin, Jacques Chirac, Junichiro Koizumi of Japan, Silvio Berlusconi, Gerhard Schroeder, and Vladimir Putin. So Putin was in the fold. He was one of the G8. He was very much in that fold. So this idea that the West has never tried to work with Russia and has never tried to understand Russia, Russia was treated as an equal member of the G8. This is a point I've made before, and I'm yet to see a Putin apologist really address that. If the West wanted to just humiliate Russia and sideline Russia and take advantage of a weakened Russia, why would they have invited Russia to be a member of the G8? And at that time, the human rights situation in Russia was pretty bad. It's only got worse, but it was pretty bad then. It's never been good under Putin. Um, as far back as 2006, Putin has shown as a threat to this country when Alexander Litvinenko was poisoned in London. The Salisbury attack, I call it an attack because that's what it was. It was a case of state terrorism. A British citizen died, Don Sturgis. So those who say we should stay out of the Ukraine situation is none of our business, they're forgetting that Putin's Russia has directly threatened this country. Now, you cannot point to an equivalent where a former British agent has been poisoned by MI6 in Russia on Putin's watch, or where MI6 goes around the world poisoning critics of Rishi Sunak. It just doesn't happen in that way. And I'm not saying MI6 is angelic, but the moral equivalencies need to be challenged. Putin's regime is fundamentally a gangster regime. It's a government that basically behaves like a mafia outfit. Rewarding sycophantic kleptocrats and tycoons, and this is the nature of the Putin regime. That's why trying to say, well, let's just listen to Russia's point of view, and I really get sick of that argument. I also think that there's powerful countries like Brazil and India and South Africa that have failed in their leadership as democracies, albeit flawed democracies, but democracies nonetheless, to stand up, at least condemn Putin's excesses. I think taking neutrality in the case of tyranny is indeed siding with the oppressor. So India's neutrality and the absurd position of President Lula da Silva of Brazil of actually blaming the victims, blaming Ukraine for what happened, is obscene. And I hope the Ukrainians remember that and make da Silva persona non grata. He's recently attacked Israel for the purported genocide. Well, if he's so concerned about human rights, and the thing about da Silva, I actually do commend some of his work in Brazil. He has tried to improve relations with indigenous Brazilians and improve the situation with the Amazon. I give him credit, but it's a real pity that he is so wrong when it comes to Russia and Ukraine. Um, South Africa, again, it sort of sat on the fence with this. I think a lot of the developing world sort of perversely sees Putin as the answer to the countering the West, but they're deluded if they think that Putin is the answer because everything Putin does is self-interested. Um, the Wagner Group has caused misery in Africa. They've directly funded massacres. I think that I think that one of the biggest weapons in the world today is propaganda. We've seen this in modern wars. We've seen it in Georgia, in Ukraine, certainly Israel, Gaza. But there's one thing Russia has been effective in. I hate to admit it, but it's true. Russia has been effective, particularly during the Syrian war, of industrial scale disinformation, industrial scale propaganda. Now, every media outlet has propaganda, but if you look at Russian state media, they are so sycophantic and so tied in with the Putin regime that you can't separate the two, really. You can't say the same thing about the BBC and the British government. It's just a flawed comparison. For all the criticism you can level at the BBC, they're not sycophants to Rishi Sunak's government. They're just not. Compared to RT or other Russian state mouthpieces who really are sycophants to Putin. Um, since the death of Navalny, I saw a good cartoon. It was actually in the Sun. It showed a chess game, and it showed a cowering little Putin and a tall. I mean, Navalny was a tall guy. The ghost of Navalny kind of looking over Putin, and the thing was whose move. The point here is that really, although he's a powerful individual, very powerful individual, at core, Putin is a coward because instead of facing his critics, he just gets his thugs to brutalize them and to poison them. So at core, Putin is a coward. He can't handle criticism. I think all dictators are like that. Xi Jinping is the same. Xi's regime is so paranoid that basically Winnie the Pooh is banned in China because there was comparisons with Winnie the Pooh and Xi Jinping. But anyway, I'm going to wrap this up. But we need to set the record straight. If you look at, in fact, I haven't even said everything I wanted to in this video. NATO has surrounded Russia. That's a perverse argument. I mean, for one thing, look at a map of the world. The vast majority of Russia's land border is in Asia, and even European Russia, it doesn't all border NATO. Now, why did Finland join NATO? The president of Finland said explicitly, we feel we've had to do this because of Russia's antics. I mean, this is typical bully boy mentality. It's a little bit like Germany in the world wars, whereby we can't understand why the West is so hostile to us. Margarita Simonian was bleating about this when she was questioned by the BBC's Steve Rosenberg. She said, why is the West trying to destroy Russia? This is something that's very perverse about the Russian nationalist mindset. Why don't you love us? Why won't you be our Russian speaking brothers? We'll invade you to get you on side. We'll brutalize you and subjugate you, but please join us. It's an insane way of thinking. It's basically might is right. That is the Russian mindset, the Russian nationalist mindset, I should say. But let's just be clear, Russia invaded Ukraine, not the other way around. The 2014 referendum was a bogus referendum. I don't deny that there will be Ukrainians that were pro-Russian, but the fact of the matter is that illegal annexation and the flawed referendum was entirely based on Putin's irredentism. Even Alexei Navalny, who at that time, he angered Ukrainians by also repeating Putin's narrative of that, Navalny changed his position and he accepted that was an illegal annexation. But the fact of the matter is, Russia invaded Ukraine. NATO has never directly attacked Russia. Now, maybe if Russia hadn't been so belligerent to smaller neighbouring states, then you wouldn't see countries applying to join NATO, like Georgia, like Ukraine. Why are they applying to join NATO? Because they want protection from Russian tyranny. You ask someone whether they would rather live in a liberal democracy or live in Putin's Russia. And this is the irony, because Putin's useful idiots like Tucker Carlson and co. would not opt to live in Russia. This is why I think they're fundamentally moral cards, because they will regurgitate Putin's lies. They will talk about how it's the West to blame. But given a choice between living in a liberal democracy or Russia, yeah, when push comes to shove, they'll be pretty damn clear where they lie on that. Anyway, there's not really much more to say, but this is why I reject this narrative of Russia the victim. I do think the Russian people are victims. I think they're victims of brainwashing. I mean, leading up to the invasion of Ukraine, there was an extensive propaganda campaign demonizing the Ukrainians as so called Nazis and implying there was going to be mass murder of Russian citizens. And, they were subjected to these really, really graphic propaganda films. Um, that's it's sick. I mean, so if you're a Russian citizen and you're constantly subjected to that, no wonder you're going to hate the Ukrainians and hate the West. But it hasn't been the West threatening nuclear annihilation of Russian cities. It's been ultra nationalists on Russian state TV that have done that. I mean, there is a fundamentally unhinged mindset with Russian nationalism, and I totally reject that it's a victimhood. I think the Russian people are victims. I think Russian soldiers are victims. That documentary I watched the other day, honestly, I didn't feel hatred towards those Russian soldiers. I think they're poor fools. I think they're being used by Putin. And I hope one day they see the truth. I mean, one of them, I have to say, an officer said, it saddens me that our Ukrainian brothers cannot see this. We have to just go to Kiev and get rid of the Nazi government, and then they will come into our side. They genuinely believe this. They genuinely believe that if they eradicate Ukraine's very existence as a nation state, then the Ukrainians will just, like little children, just come into the fold. They just don't get it. It's the same mentality the Chinese have with Taiwan. It's this patronizing idea of treating the Ukrainians like children or treating the Taiwanese like children. Um, and that's something that's particularly sick about the Russian mindset, the Russian nationalist mindset. Um, so I think one of the biggest things that the West needs to focus on is the propaganda thing. Um, I absolutely support RT as a Kremlin mouthpiece being blocked in this country. It's not just another journalistic source, it's part of the Putin regime. There's absolutely no way we should have given them a free platform to insult Putin's victims. Um, the latest news is that now dissidents in Britain are being targeted. We could have another Alexander Litvinenko case in this country. So, Putin's apologists need to get their head out of the sand and wake up. This regime doesn't function normally. It's a totalitarian regime that has no tolerance of dissent within Russia. Its foreign policy is based on irredentist obsessions and paranoia, and I don't think it wants to work with the West. I mean, Putin apologists will always blame the West and NATO, but like I say, the West and NATO has tried to work with Putin. At one point, it was even postured, the idea was even postured that maybe Russia could join NATO. No, that's never going to happen, certainly not under Putin. But for a brief moment, I remember seeing the press conferences of Bill Clinton and Boris Yeltsin. It was all smiles, and there was a possibility of optimism. But you either come down to saying, well, Putin's right, and all the Western leaders are wrong, or you consider that 5 American presidents and 7 British prime ministers have all been wrong, and they're all out to get Putin. It's pathetic, that conclusion. So I do reject the narrative of Russia the victim. I think Russians are victims of Vladimir Putin's regime, but Putin is a thug. Putin is a tyrant, and Putin is entirely responsible for the mess that Russia is in. Entirely.